Hey guys. Before we get going, if you find something worthwhile in what I make here, feel free to leave a like and hit subscribe, but only if you honestly mean it. And drop a line in the comments, letting me know where in the world you're listening from and what the time is where you are. It always fascinates me to see just how far and wide this little gathering stretches. Now, into the history. Picture yourself climbing out of bed, or rather out of the heap of straw politely pretending to be a bed, and deciding that today perhaps you'll look a touch less like a mud street disaster. You spot that handsome scrap of fur you found at the market and imagine sauntering into the village like a medieval trendsetter. Bad news. Congratulations, you've just broken the law. In the Middle Ages, fashion was not a question of taste, it was official policy. This is where sumptuary laws come in, which more or less demanded that you wear your class on your sleeve. Literally, if you were a peasant, you were stuck with wool. Scratchy, drab brown wool, itchy enough to make you doubt the mercy of God. The nobles, meanwhile, drifted about in silk so vivid they looked as if someone had dipped them in unicorn blood. Dare to copy them, and the law would take note. The authorities might track you down, shame you in public, or worse, throw you behind bars. Imagine wasting away in a dungeon while rats nibbled at your shoes, all because your cloak looked a little too regal for your rank. Hardly the glorious rebellion you had pictured. And the nobles didn't simply forbid the odd colour. No, they were painfully specific. Purple was for royalty, and no one else. Fur trims such as ermine were forbidden unless your title ran longer than your family tree. Even footwear had its rules. The wealthy strutted about in poulaines, those absurd pointed shoes so long they had to be fastened up to the knee. You, a humble dirt farmer, were expected to wear boots shaped like actual human feet, practical, dull, and hopelessly unfashionable. The reasoning behind all this nonsense was straightforward. The rich wanted to remain visibly rich. If you started to resemble them too closely, the whole flimsy hierarchy might come crashing down. Imagine a nobleman being mistaken for the fellow who shovels pig manure. Unthinkable. There was an economic side to it too. Nobles had no interest in peasants squandering coin on silk scarves when that money could be going to rent, taxes, and the occasional bribe just to keep breathing. Looking good was, in effect, theft. Theft of noble dignity. So you shrug into your compulsory sackcloth and shuffle out into the daylight, looking precisely as wretched as the law intended. Because in the Middle Ages, your gravest crime was never rebellion, heresy, or theft. It was daring to look fabulous while standing ankle-deep in mud. Now it's evening. You're seated by the hearth, savouring the single moment of warmth you'll get all day, when suddenly the town bell begins to clang. No, it isn't summoning you to supper. It's the medieval equivalent of your landlord telling you to stop enjoying yourself. The curfew bell. The word curfew comes from the French couvre-feu, meaning cover your fire. At the sound of that bell, you were expected to smother your hearth, pinch out your candles, and plunge your whole life into darkness. Not because the authorities cared whether you were well rested. No, It was because your entire town was built of wood, straw, and pure flammability. One careless soul leaving a candle burning could turn the whole place into a raging inferno before midnight. So in theory, the rule makes perfect sense, but in practice it meant fumbling around your hut in the pitch black, tripping over chickens, and stepping into suspicious puddles you dearly hoped were only water. Forget reading. Not that you could. Forget sewing or working late, unless you fancied jabbing a needle straight through your hand by candlelight. Nightlife, as far as you were concerned, simply did not exist. The wealthy, of course, weren't quite so bound by the same rules. Nobles had stone houses and servants to make sure they didn't burn their castles down, so their fires could keep crackling. But you were stuck with an enforced bedtime, courtesy of the bell tower. And if you were caught ignoring it, the fine would cost you more than a week's wages. The bell wasn't only about fire either. Darkness kept people indoors, which meant fewer drunks lurching about stabbing one another, and fewer thieves skulking in the alleys. Think of it as the medieval government saying, "We can't stop crime, but we can at least make sure you're too frightened to leave the house after dark." So there you lie on your straw mattress, wide awake, listening to rats gnaw at the beams and neighbours snore through the thin wooden walls, all because someone decided the safest way to run a town was to treat every resident like a 6-year-old at bedtime. It isn't glamorous, but the curfew bell very likely saved countless towns from going up in smoke. Still, when you blow out your candle tonight, just remember the rule exists, not because you're careless, but because someone else certainly is. You wake up hungry. You've spent all morning daydreaming about roasted pork, maybe even a slab of beef if fortune smiles. You wander into the kitchen, which is really the one-room hut you share with your family, and reality slaps you across the face. It's Friday, which means no meat again. Welcome to medieval dietary law, brought to you by the church. Nearly half the calendar was off limits for meat. Fridays, Lent, Advent, and endless feast days honouring saints you've never even heard of. It all adds up to more fish than you ever cared to lay eyes on. Forget bacon. It's salted herring again. The spiritual message was discipline and sacrifice. The practical message was, please stop devouring all the cows before winter. It may sound absurd, but there was logic in it. Cows were precious. They pulled ploughs, gave milk, and provided leather. If everyone butchered them at the first pang of hunger, the whole farming system would collapse faster than your appetite at the sight of yet another pickled fish. These rules stretched the food supply, propped up the fishing trade, and held together some fragile sense of order in a world always one bad harvest away from famine. None of which makes it any more enjoyable. Picture trudging home after 12 hours in the fields, only to be greeted by a plate of dried fish glaring back at you as though it knows how disappointed you are. The rich had it a little better. They could get their hands on sturgeon, eels, or elaborate almond-based imitation meat dishes. You, on the other hand, were left gnawing on a bony carp that tasted of mud. People cheated, naturally. Smugglers peddled contraband meat on fasting days, and plenty of peasants quietly roasted a chicken behind closed doors. But get caught, and you faced fines, public shaming, or penance, which usually meant standing in church for hours while everyone stared as though you'd personally doomed their souls. The irony is that these dietary restrictions shaped whole economies. Towns flourished on fishing. Monasteries grew wealthy on preserved fish, and fasting days pushed cooks to get inventive with grains, vegetables, and legumes. So as you chew through your 47th plate of salted herring, take some comfort in knowing you aren't suffering for nothing. You're holding up medieval Europe's version of food security. Even so, No rule in history has ever made fish taste like bacon, and that is the real tragedy. You're starving. Your family is starving. The cabbage stew you've eaten all week tastes like sadness in liquid form. Then you see it. A plump rabbit hopping cheerfully through the woods, practically begging to be roasted. Perfect. Wrong. That rabbit belongs to your Lord. Everything belongs to your Lord. The trees, the deer, the boar, and yes, even that smug little rabbit. Welcome to medieval hunting law, where catching your own dinner without permission could brand you a criminal. The forests were not public land. They were the medieval version of a private game reserve, and your local noble had no intention of sharing. He didn't care that you were chewing turnips like a desperate goat. He wanted venison for his feast, and you were not invited. So if you dared to snare that rabbit, you were poaching, a crime taken nearly as seriously as murder. The punishments varied, but none were pleasant. Best case, a fine you could never hope to pay. Worst case, a hand hacked off. Truly bad case, execution. Imagine being hanged for the medieval equivalent of stealing a chicken nugget. And the nobles didn't guard their game purely out of greed. Hunting rights were a way of displaying power. Riding into the forest with hounds and crossbows wasn't merely recreation, it was a live-action flex. Meanwhile, you were expected to applaud politely as your betters slaughtered animals you weren't even permitted to touch. Peasants poached anyway, of course. Hunger is persuasive, and rabbits breed faster than any punishment could ever keep pace with. Whole villages sometimes joined forces for secret hunts, slipping into the woods at night with nets and clubs. The thrill wasn't only in catching food, it was in defying the system, if only for one meal. But get caught, and let's just say the Lord didn't admire your resourcefulness. The irony is that while you risked death over a single rabbit, nobles killed animals by the score, purely for sport. Hundreds of deer might be slaughtered in one hunt, not because anyone needed that much meat, but because it looked impressive. So you walk home empty-handed, stomach growling, dreaming of roast rabbit you'll never taste. Because in medieval Europe, survival wasn't about skill. It was about remembering that even the wildlife knew its place better than you did. You've been accused of stealing a loaf of bread. Did you steal it? It doesn't matter. In the Middle Ages, the truth wasn't settled by evidence or witnesses, it was settled by God. And God, apparently, moonlighted as a game show host. Welcome to trial by ordeal, justice delivered with all the subtlety of a sledgehammer. The reasoning was simple. If you were innocent, God would protect you. If you were guilty, He'd let you burn, drown, or bleed. Which sounds fair enough until you remember that medieval Europe was overflowing with innocent people, cursed with terrible luck. Take the ordeal by fire. The judge hands you a red-hot iron bar and tells you to walk 3 paces. You do it, skin sizzling like breakfast bacon. Then they bandage your hand and wait 3 days. If it heals cleanly, congratulations, you're innocent. If it festers, which in a world without soap or antibiotics it absolutely will, then you're guilty. Enjoy your punishment. Or perhaps you draw the ordeal by water. They bind you up and hurl you into a pond. Sink, and you're innocent, though now resting at the bottom of the river. Float, and you're guilty. The idea was that pure water would reject a liar, which is exactly the sort of nonsense you dream up when no one has invented science yet. And then there was the ordeal by combat. Someone accuses you of a crime, and, instead of lawyers, the two of you seize swords and go at it, with God supposedly picking the winner. Sounds noble, until you notice the other fellow stands 6'5" and has trained since birth while you've spent your life hoeing potatoes. Guess who God favours today? To be fair, these ordeals weren't always taken quite so literally. Priests sometimes interpreted the results generously to avoid killing too many people. And eventually, the church banned ordeals altogether in the 13th century, partly because they realised that burning a man's hand to see what happens wasn't the most reliable legal system. But for centuries, trials by ordeal were the gold standard of justice, which means that if you'd lived back then, your innocence wasn't proven by honesty or good character. It was proven by whether you could survive medieval party tricks involving fire and water. So the next time you grumble about jury duty, remember that at least no one is asking you to grip a hot iron bar and pray that divine skincare saves you. It's Sunday morning. You'd love to sleep in, but the church bells are already clanging as though someone were beating a cow with a frying pan. You drag yourself off to Mass, because if you don't, you risk fines, penance, or worse still, public gossip, which, in a medieval village, travels faster than the plague itself. Now, here's the trouble. Once Mass has ended, work of any kind is off the table. No ploughing, no weaving, no patching the roof that's presently leaking straight into your stew pot. The principle is straightforward. Sunday belongs to God, not to you. You're meant to rest, reflect, and steer clear of sin. Which sounds lovely in theory, right up until you remember that your landlord isn't moved by your resting. He still expects his rent, and the weeds in your field never received the Sabbath notice. To be fair to the church, this wasn't enforced out of pure devotion. A weekly day off kept peasants from grinding themselves straight into an early grave. In a world where a holiday meant collapsing face first in the mud, Sunday was the single day you might avoid keeling over among the furrows. Think of it as medieval HR policy dressed up in scripture. Rest, mind you, was a loose term. You weren't lounging with wine and cheese. You were enduring a 2-hour Latin sermon you couldn't follow, chased by prayer without end. Afterward, perhaps you'd steal a nap before the priest reminded you that idleness, too, counted as sin. So Sunday handed you a choice: be bored into holiness, or feel guilty for being lazy. Exceptions did exist naturally. Nobles kept hunting, servants kept serving, and true emergencies like smothering a fire or delivering a baby didn't register as work. But if you attempted a little sneaky extra farming, somebody would inform on you, and before long you'd be standing barefoot in church while the priest dressed you down in front of the entire village. Even so, the rule endured. Without it, peasants might well have been worked 7 days a week until they simply dropped. The Sabbath granted at least the appearance of rest, a thin buffer between ceaseless labour and the death waiting at the end of it. So you plod home from church, spoon down your cold porridge, and rest by gazing at the wall. Congratulations, you've made it through another Sunday without stumbling into sin. More or less. You've decided you're finished with farming mud and living on cabbage soup, so you'd like to take up a trade. Perhaps you'll become a baker, or a blacksmith, or even a weaver. Fine idea, except you can't just start pounding metal or hawking loaves. First, you'll need the blessing of the medieval equivalent of a mafia family, the guild. Guilds ran everything. Fancy baking bread? You'd better belong to the Bakers' Guild. Fancy shoeing horses? The Farriers' Guild. Fancy whittling wooden spoons? Believe it or not, there was very likely a guild for that as well. And if you dared to work outside the system, you'd be fined, run out of town, or occasionally beaten until the rules came back to you. Getting in was no small thing. First, you'd pass years as an apprentice, essentially labouring for nothing in exchange for experience. From there, you'd rise to journeyman, drifting about earning wages while still bound by guild rules. Only once you'd produced a masterpiece, a flawless specimen of your craft, could you petition to become a master yourself. And who sat in judgment of that masterpiece? The other masters in the guild, every one of whom had a solid reason to keep membership small. Sounds familiar, doesn't it? At first blush, the whole arrangement feels suffocating, but there were sound reasons behind it. Guilds fixed quality standards, so no one died from bread cut with sawdust or armor that split apart on the first blow. They regulated prices to keep the marketplace from descending into chaos. They also shielded members from competition, which sounds rather less noble, though it works splendidly if you were on the inside. For you, the downside was plain enough. Without membership, you couldn't legally sell your work. You'd end up like that fellow who opened a discount bakery and had his oven smashed to pieces by guild enforcers. Medieval Yelp reviews weren't composed in words. They arrived as bricks through your window. Still, the guilds offered security. Belonged to one, and you had protection, training, and a say in your town's affairs. Fall outside it, and you were merely one more peasant pretending to know his way around an anvil. So you swallow your pride, sweep the shop floor for 7 years as an apprentice, and pray your masterpiece won't be turned away. Because in the Middle Ages, you couldn't simply follow your passion. You followed the guild, or nothing at all. You don't own a clock. You wouldn't even recognize one. Time, for you, is whatever the local church bell declares it to be, and those bells never quiet down. They ring to rouse you from sleep. They ring to haul you off to prayer. They ring for work, for rest, for meals, for bed. In short, the bell tower was your overbearing parent, and you couldn't even slam a bedroom door to get away from it. Picture the scene. You're out in the fields, finally gaining ground with the plough, when clang, clang, clang. Time to stop and pray. You mumble a few words toward heaven, return to your work, and just as the rhythm comes back, clang, 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 the noon bells. Time for your gourmet spread of bread, onions, and disappointment. A couple of hours on, right when you imagine you might catch up, vespers, and off you go again. Nor was it strictly a matter of religion. The bells governed civic life as well. They announced market hours, curfews, and emergencies. Fire in the town? Bells. Enemy at the gates? Bells. Someone important has died? Bells. Essentially, they were the medieval version of push notifications, constant, loud, and impossible to switch off. Worst of all, you had no voice in any of it. The priest or the town officials decided when the bells sounded, and you obeyed. It didn't matter whether you were exhausted, mid-meal, or halfway through something that mattered. The bell owned you. Oversleep? Everyone knows, because you missed the morning bells. Duck out of work early? Everyone knows, because the bells hadn't yet rung. Skip mass? The bells tolled on you. In theory, they brought order to a world without watches or literacy. Most people couldn't read a calendar, never mind track the hours, so the sound of bells organized the chaos. For you, though, it meant a life spent less in freedom and more as Pavlov's dog, centuries ahead of Pavlov. So you carry on, ears ringing, your whole existence chopped into bell-shaped portions of time. Because in the Middle Ages, you didn't ask what time it was. You waited for the bells to tell you who you were, where you belonged, and precisely how little control you actually held. You stink. Everyone stinks. It is the Middle Ages, after all. So when you finally scrape together enough coins for a trip to the local bathhouse, you allow yourself to hope that maybe, just maybe, you'll walk out smelling a little less like a damp goat. In you go, ready to scour weeks of grime from your skin, only to find the doors bolted shut. Why? because the town authorities have decided bathhouses are essentially plague factories. And in fairness, they weren't entirely off the mark. Bathhouses weren't only for bathing. They doubled as social clubs, gossip hubs, and, let's be honest, budget brothels. A spot where you could chat, soak, and pick up a disease in one tidy visit. When syphilis and plague tore through Europe, the bathhouse became everyone's favourite scapegoat. Shut them down, and perhaps folks would stop dropping like flies, or perhaps they'd just keep stinking, which is at least less contagious. Here's the snag though. Without bathhouses, your options for washing narrow considerably. Cleaning up at home means lugging buckets of freezing water from the well, tipping them into a wooden tub, and pretending this qualifies as a spa day. Soap costs a fortune, hot water is a luxury. And frankly, your family would sooner burn that firewood to cook a meal than to guarantee you don't smell like despair. The nobles, of course, didn't always live by the same rules. They enjoyed private baths, perfumed oils, and servants to scrub them clean. You're left rubbing yourself down with a rag, hoping nobody notices that your natural musk could frighten off wolves. And here's the real punchline. The church often eyed public bathing with suspicion anyway. Too much nudity. Too much mingling of the sexes. Too much fun. If you enjoyed it, odds were it was sinful. So bathhouses hovered in a strange moral grey zone, tolerated 1 year and banned the next. You never quite knew whether an evening soak would leave you refreshed or excommunicated. So you shuffle back home, dirt still packed beneath your nails, hair greasy, skin itching. You tell yourself bathing is overrated, that no one notices anyway. Except they do. They all do. Everyone in your village carries the same bouquet, sweat, smoke, livestock, and failure. Because in the Middle Ages, washing wasn't merely a question of hygiene, it was a matter of politics, morality, and whether the town regarded your bathhouse as saving souls or spreading death. Spoiler, probably both. You've done it. After months of back-breaking labour and porridge that tastes of sorrow, you've set aside a few coins. Maybe you think you'll treat yourself. Maybe you'll buy something nice. Something that declares, I may be poor, but I still have my self-respect. Wrong. Medieval law says you can't. Welcome back to sumptuary laws. The rules crafted to ensure you never dressed better than your betters. Say you're a prosperous merchant. You've earned decent money trading wool, and now you'd like a velvet tunic. Not so fast. Velvet is set aside for nobles. Purple cloth? Out of the question. That's practically the trademark shade of royalty. Fur trim? Only if your family tree includes someone with a numeral after his name. For you, the law prescribes beige potato sack chic. And enforcement was no joke. Inspectors genuinely wandered the towns, checking hems, fabrics, and colours. Wear silk without the proper pedigree and you'd be fined. Imagine having to explain that you're in debt because you bought a shirt slightly too shiny. It's fashion policing at its purest. The reasoning, naturally, was order. If a duke and a merchant both strolled into church wearing the same outfit, chaos might follow. How would anyone know to whom they ought to bow? Nobles couldn't risk being taken for commoners, so the law kept the classes visually apart, like medieval colour-coded uniforms. And don't imagine you could slip past the rules. People tattled. If a neighbour caught you in a cloak that looked a touch too lavish, they'd report you, not out of any concern for the law, but because watching you humiliated in court was the finest entertainment they'd see all month. Meanwhile, the nobles themselves paraded about in outfits so gaudy they needed whole servants just to carry their sleeves. Their shoes tapered into points so long they had to be tied up to the knees. And you? You're fortunate to own a belt buckle that doesn't rust. So you shelve your dreams of velvet and settle for another wool tunic, melting back into the grey-brown sea of mediocrity that passed for medieval fashion among the non-elite. Because in this world, clothes didn't merely make the man. They reminded him exactly how low he ranked. You're hungry again, which is less a surprise than a permanent condition. Today you think maybe you'll splurge on something fine, a goose or white bread like the nobles eat. Sadly, the medieval rulebook is already chuckling at you. Because in this world, even your dinner is a reminder that you don't matter. Food was sorted by class, and the laws made certain you understood it. Nobles got the good things: venison, swan, pheasant, and white bread milled from refined flour. You, on the other hand, got barley bread so dense it could double as a weapon. You ate onions, leeks, cabbage, and more cabbage. When in doubt, always more cabbage. Your stew wasn't seasoned with herbs, it was seasoned with despair. White bread stung most of all. It wasn't merely tastier, it was a status symbol outright. Only the wealthy could afford to squander good flour on delicate loaves, while you were left with dark bread that looked and tasted like a doorstop. And if you tried to work around it, say, buy a goose on the quiet or slip some venison into your pot, congratulations. You're guilty of eating above your station. Fines, public shaming, or worse. Imagine explaining to your children that you're sitting in prison over bread. These laws weren't purely a matter of class snobbery, they carried a practical logic as well. By keeping the finest foods locked behind status, the society stretched its scarce supplies. If every peasant were roasting swans each Sunday, the Duke would find his banquet table bare. And let's be candid, the Duke's banquet was always destined to count for more than your survival. None of that, of course, kept peasants from daydreaming. Songs and jokes loved to imagine some poor soul slipping away with a haunch of venison or a roasted goose. Food was the fantasy of the age, the medieval equivalent of a winning lottery ticket. You weren't picturing castles or crowns, only a single meal that didn't taste like boiled mud. So you swallow another bowl of watery barley gruel, gazing across the way at the nobles' hall. They're tearing into roasted peacock while you gnaw at bread firm enough to crack a tooth. Because in medieval Europe, even the contents of your plate were a law-backed reminder that your seat in the world was fixed at the very bottom of the table. You cough once in the marketplace. A mistake. All at once, every pair of eyes swivels toward you as though you'd just admitted to witchcraft. Welcome to plague season, when a single sneeze can shut down your whole street. In the Middle Ages, quarantine wasn't something you opted into. If a person in your home fell ill, the authorities would cheerfully bar your door from the outside and fasten a cross to it, so the entire town understood you'd become a walking biohazard. You stayed put until everyone within had either recovered or been buried. Fresh air? Not a chance. The governing wisdom was simple. Better one dead household than one dead village. Comforting. Markets shuttered, inns shuttered, weddings, fairs and festivals all vanished. In short, anything that made existence a shade less grim was struck from the calendar. The reasoning held up. Keep people separated, and perhaps they'd stop handing out death like free samples at a fair. But for you, it added up to hunger, isolation, and a great many strained conversations with your family in one tight room. If you happened to be a gravedigger, matters grew grimmer still. The authorities drove you to labour around the clock, dragging bodies, carving trenches, and praying you didn't catch the very sickness you were interring. Refuse, and you'd be punished as a criminal, and then probably die regardless. Career prospects were dim. And let's not overlook the travel bans. Entire towns bolted their gates against outsiders. Strangers drew suspicion, merchants were turned back, and if you did slip through, pitchforks greeted you rather than hospitality. Tourism during plague years wasn't exactly booming. These rules did have their flashes of medieval cleverness. A handful of cities genuinely lowered their death tolls by imposing strict quarantine. Others simply panicked, shut everything, and hoped God might take notice. Either way, the outcome was the same. You, penned at home, rationing stale crusts and praying your neighbour's cough didn't seep through the walls. So you sit in your sealed house, studying your family, wondering who will be the next to start coughing. The lone bright side, for once, is that you needn't go to church. Though it's hard to feel festive when the priest is out front, branding your door like the medieval version of a hazard sticker. Because in the Middle Ages, breaking quarantine didn't merely gamble with your own life. It gambled with the whole village. And the whole village was deeply motivated to keep you indoors, permanently if it came to that. At last you die. Congratulations. The catch is that even in death, the rules still have you by the throat. You'd assume burial would be straightforward. Dig a hole, lower you in, murmur a prayer, finished. But no, this is the Middle Ages. Where you end up resting depends less on your soul than on your purse. First trouble, consecrated ground. To lie in the churchyard you need coin. Fees for a decent grave, fees for the priest, fees for candles. If you can't cover it, your body might be dumped in a mass pit beyond the walls with a lovely view of the town rubbish heap. Hope you're fond of the aroma of rotting cabbage, because you'll be sharing eternity with it. Second trouble, space. Cemeteries filled quickly, and once they were full, the gravediggers didn't go buying more land. They simply dug you back up after a few years, tipped your bones into a charnel pit, and recycled your plot. Yes, even in death you got evicted. Nothing says rest in peace quite like being stacked like firewood in the corner of a bone house. Third trouble, the manner of your death. Suicide? Forget consecrated ground. Executed for a crime? Your corpse might dangle on public display, or be planted at a crossroads so your restless spirit wouldn't trouble decent folk. Die of plague, and it's straight into the nearest trench with a dusting of quicklime on top. No ceremony, no dignity. And don't assume the church was always tender-hearted. If you'd been excommunicated, they wouldn't allow your body anywhere near holy soil. So eternal damnation wasn't punishment enough. Now you're barred from the graveyard too. The wealthy, naturally, fared better. Nobles received tombs, effigies, and sometimes a permanent berth inside the church itself, where their marble likeness could scowl down at peasants for centuries. You'd count yourself fortunate if your marker was anything more than a stone with "Here lies nobody important" scratched into it. So even in death, you grasp that the Middle Ages never tired of reminding you of your place. The rules didn't only dictate how you lived, they dictated how you rotted. And the closing joke, your descendants will most likely forget where you're buried anyway. Because in medieval Europe, even the afterlife kept a waiting list. You're in the tavern, a few mugs of ale to the good, when your friend mumbles that the bishop's new hat looks like a stolen beehive. You laugh, perhaps a touch too loudly. Poor decision. In the Middle Ages, mocking the church wasn't merely rude, it was a crime, and a grave one. You see, the church wasn't only about Sunday sermons and stained glass. It was the largest landholder in all of Europe, richer than kings, and effectively the medieval blend of Amazon and the tax collector rolled into one, which meant insulting a priest or questioning doctrine was like bad-mouthing your boss, while that boss owned your house, your food, and your soul. Not wise. Punishments varied, but none were gentle. You might be fined or forced into public penance. Picture yourself standing barefoot in church while everyone stares as though you'd broken wind during Mass, or, if you truly overstepped, branded a heretic. And once that label clung to you, things turned hot, quite literally, because heresy and fire tended to travel together. The rules weren't just about safeguarding faith, they were about safeguarding power. The church's authority rested on people believing it stood beyond reach. If a priest could be mocked without consequence, the whole structure might begin to sway. And the medieval church did not abide swaying. So you kept your jokes to yourself. Perhaps you whispered them after dark in the barn, once you were certain no one could hear. But even then, caution was wise. Neighbors informed. People traded favors by reporting blasphemy. And honestly, who wouldn't turn you in for a little less penance of their own? Meanwhile, the clergy themselves weren't always paragons of virtue. Some lived in luxury, kept mistresses, or hoarded fortunes. But criticizing that was off limits. He had to smile, nod, and pretend the bishop's 15-course feast was spiritually uplifting while you gnawed on stale bread. So you bite your tongue, laugh politely through sermons, and never again crack a joke about priests in public. Because in the Middle Ages, free speech simply didn't exist. And if you forgot that, the church had no shortage of inventive ways to remind you. Because here, sticks and stones might break your bones, but words could genuinely get you burned. Night falls. You're finally home after a long day of breaking your back for someone else's gain. All you want is to sit by the fire, eat your thin stew, and perhaps not freeze. But just as you begin to feel human again, the church bell rings out. The meaning is plain. Cover your fire. Snuff your candles. The evening is over. This wasn't advice, it was law. Your hearth had to be smothered at night, or you risked fines, punishment, or worse, torching the entire village because you dozed off with a log still glowing. And in a settlement built wholly of wood, thatched roofs, and questionable judgment, fire spread faster than gossip after Mass. One tipsy farmer could turn every house into a bonfire, and no one wanted that. So you obey. You heap dirt over your fire, muttering curses, and pass the rest of the night shivering in the dark. Your entertainment is limited. Talk to the family you're already sick of, listen to the rats in the rafters, or lie awake imagining how cozy the nobles must be right now in their stone castles with several fireplaces roaring. The rich, of course, didn't always keep to this rule. Lords and bishops had stone halls and servants to mind the flames, so they could keep their fires burning all night. You, though, are the hazard. The law wasn't written for them. It was written because your hovel is essentially one enormous torch waiting for its moment. And while the rule did prevent ruinous fires, it also made the nights wretched. Darkness wasn't peaceful. It was frightening. Thieves, wolves, and drunk neighbours spoiling for a fight all came alive after curfew. The fire wasn't only warmth, it was protection. Without it, you sit in the black like bait, hoping nothing out there decides you look like a meal. Still, the law endured for centuries. Fire was at once your closest friend and your deadliest foe, and medieval life was already perilous enough without waking in a heap of ash. So you draw the blanket tighter, listen to the silence, and wait for dawn. Because in the Middle Ages, survival wasn't about comfort. It was about obedience. And if that meant freezing through the night so the town didn't burn, then congratulations. Once again, you've suffered for the greater good. Exile was hardly a novelty in the Viking world. Honor-bound societies had a savage method for handling troublemakers. If you slew the wrong man, or upset the delicate balance of power, you were declared an outlaw. That is precisely what befell Eric the Red. Following a string of violent quarrels in Iceland, among them a blood feud that left men dead, Eric was sentenced to banishment. With nowhere left to turn, he looked westward, drawn by tales of a distant land once glimpsed by sailors blown off their course. When Eric's ship at last carved through the fog and ice to reach Greenland's shore, it must have felt more like a sentence than a promise. The horizon bristled with glaciers. The valleys were wind-scoured and bare, the soil thin and stony. Winter bit deep, even during the summer months. To most eyes, this was no country for farming, let alone raising families. But Eric was more than a warrior. He was a salesman. He grasped how words could shape a destiny. He chose to name this harsh new country Greenland. It was a bold lie, but a serviceable one. Where others saw cold rock and snowfields, Eric conjured a vision of fertile meadows and grassy slopes. The name by itself hinted at hope, a place where farmers might flourish, where families could begin anew, where land-hungry settlers could flee the crowding of Iceland. His brilliance lay not in taming Greenland, but in persuading others that it could be tamed. He dwelled on abundance, never scarcity. The promise of land was impossible to resist, for Viking families squeezed by rising populations and dwindling resources at home. Some sailed out of necessity, others chasing adventure. They wagered everything on Eric's promise, trading familiar ground for a world that was far more ice than green. What lay in wait for them was not paradise, but survival at its cruelest. Still, had Eric the Red not renamed the place so shrewdly, Greenland might have stayed an empty waste, glimpsed only by sailors blown off course. Instead, it became the setting for one of the boldest tests of Viking endurance ever attempted. The Great Wager opened in the summer of 985 CE. Eric had talked dozens of families into following him, and together they readied their longships for the most dangerous crossing any of them would ever make. This was nothing like a raid. A swift blow struck across the water and gone. These vessels carried everything a whole society would need to start over from nothing. Cattle and sheep were wedged into pens on deck. Goats stood tethered beside barrels of drinking water. There were sacks of seed grain, iron tools, and chests holding cloth and timber, too precious to leave behind. Children pressed against their mothers, while fighting men lined the rails, watching the horizon for trouble. The passage from Iceland to Greenland offered no easy sailing. The North Atlantic was a harsh instructor, and the Norse knew its lessons well. Fog came down thick swallowing cliffs and reefs until they loomed up with no warning. Sudden squalls tore at the sails, snapped ropes, and soaked everyone to the skin. Great jagged sheets of sea ice drifted past, ready to stave in a hull at a single blow. On many nights the only sounds were the creak of straining timber, and prayers murmured into the blackness. Not every ship came through. The sagas record that of the roughly 25 longships that set out, only about 14 ever reached Greenland. The others were taken by storms, wrecked outright, or forced to turn for home, crawling back with broken masts and ruined hopes. Those who kept going did so with a grim, jaw-set resolve. Turning around meant disgrace, pressing forward meant peril, but also the promise of new land and release from old debts. Shipboard life was cramped and unrelenting. Families sheltered together beneath woolen cloaks, battling seasickness and hunger. Meals were hard bread, dried fish, and whatever could be boiled up in seawater. Livestock fouled the planking, and the reek settled on everyone aboard. Yet there was toughness here too. Women spun yarn from wool even on the open sea, keeping their hands moving. When the wind fell still, men lifted rowing chants, their voices set against the roar of the waves. Children, too small to grasp the danger, found scraps of laughter with driftwood toys, between the sickening lurches whenever the ship pitched too hard. After weeks of this, the settlers at last sighted Greenland's icebound cliffs. Worn out, battered, but alive, they had crossed the least forgiving water in the world. What rose ahead of them was no green paradise, but it belonged to them, and that alone was enough to begin. When the settlers first set foot on Greenland's stony coast, their relief soon collided with the truth of the place. There were no woods to fell for timber, no soft ground waiting to be ploughed, and few signs of plenty anywhere. The mountains stood bare, the valleys ran narrow, and the weather showed no mercy. If the Norse meant to last here, they would have to force a home out of the ground itself. Their answer was both plain and clever: houses built of turf. Strips of sod were cut from the earth, stacked like bricks, and pressed close together. Walls several feet thick held back the freezing winds that poured down off the glaciers. Driftwood, carried ashore after long drifts across the ocean, became the bones of their dwellings, serving as roof beams, door frames, and props. The Vikings learned to gather every splinter the sea gave up, treating each log like treasure. Inside, these homes were dim and full of smoke. What little light there was came through small openings covered with animal hides, while fires smouldered in stone hearths, filling the rooms with warmth and stinging fumes alike. Against the cold outside, though, they were refuges. Families lay side by side on benches lined with furs, sharing warmth through the endless winter nights. The smell of drying fish, smouldering peat, and penned livestock hung in every corner. It was a long way from comfort, but it was survival. The settlement spread slowly, each family carving out its own farmstead. Barns and byres were set into the land, sheltering cattle, sheep, and goats through the frost. Fences woven from driftwood or laid up in stone enclosed the scarce pastures where animals grazed during the brief summer. Women laboured without rest at spinning wool, weaving cloth, and minding children, while men hunted seals, caribou, and now and then a polar bear to stretch their thin stores. That shared effort held the settlers together. Neighbours traded labour, tools, and stories around the fire. Greenland's harshness left no room for anything but cooperation. To be isolated was to die. And yet, on this frozen frontier, the Norse managed to rebuild a version of the homelands they had left, with halls for feasting, farms for families, and in later years even small churches. What they raised was more than shelter. These turf and driftwood homes stood for their refusal to give in, proof that even in one of the cruelest places on earth, the Vikings could shape a world of their own. To a Norse farmer, good soil was wealth itself. But in Greenland the soil was scarce, thin and grudging, the settlers quickly discovered that farming here bore little resemblance to Iceland or Norway. Summers were short, barely long enough for the grass to rise, and winters wore on without end. Even so, the colony's life hung on drawing every scrap of food from the ground. Sheep and goats became the backbone of every farm. They could feed on the coarse grasses clinging to the valleys and gave back wool, milk, and, in time, meat. Cattle were harder to keep, prized for their milk and for the standing they conferred, but expensive to carry through the long winters. Putting up hay swallowed whole seasons. Families spent their summers cutting every blade they could find, drying it, and stacking it in barns against the dark months to come. A shortage of hay meant starvation for beasts and people together. Crops stayed meagre. Barley and rye were tried in sheltered plots, but the harvests were poor. The settlers leaned heavily on dairy, on butter, cheese and curds that could be stored and traded. Fish and seal meat closed the gaps, though hunting was chancy and often demanded long treks across treacherous ice. Women brewed whey into sour drinks, and children learned early to help herd sheep, gather eggs, and tend small plots of herbs. It was a delicate balance. One failed harvest, one summer colder than usual, or a single sickness sweeping through the animals could tip everything toward ruin. Archaeology has turned up the bones of dogs, and even newborn calves, butchered in lean years, desperate measures to stretch the food when famine drew close. Survival in Greenland was never only a matter of skill. It hung as much on endurance and on luck. And yet farming was more than a way to eat. It was who they were. The settlers thought of themselves as landholders, free farmers in the old Norse mould, bound to their beasts and their fields. Even on this icy edge of the world, they held to the rhythms of home, milking at dawn, cutting hay in summer, slaughtering stock in autumn, laying by food for winter. Farming rooted them in a world forever, trying to sweep them off it. Greenland tested their resolve at every turn. The land gave little, asked much, and punished every mistake. But for more than 4 centuries, Viking families held on, proving that even at the rim of the known world, the farmer's way of life could last, at least for a while. For Viking children in Greenland, life began in the shadow of the turf houses, under the watchful eyes of a community fighting to survive. Unlike the busy markets of Norway or the farms of Iceland, childhood here was not a matter of carefree play. It meant learning early, working hard, and enduring a world where death was never far off. As soon as they could walk, children were given jobs. The smallest carried water, gathered dung for fuel, or helped keep watch over sheep grazing in the valley. A little older, they herded goats, milked cows, or collected driftwood along the fjord. Girls learned to spin and weave under their mother's patient, if stern, hands, while boys followed their fathers into the hills to watch how a man hunted seals, set nets for fish, or carved tools from bone. Childhood was an apprenticeship, and mistakes could cost dearly. Still, there was room for joy. Archaeologists have found small carved toys, horses, boats, and figures shaped from bone and wood. Those fragments hint that even amid hardship, parents tried to give their children some laughter. The fjords became playgrounds where youngsters skipped stones across the water or raced one another up the rocky slopes. But play was always balanced against duty. Childhood was short, and adulthood arrived fast. Learning came by mouth, steeped in stories and sagas. Around the hearth at night, the elders told of Odin and Thor, or the voyages of legendary forebears. These tales were not merely amusement. They were lessons in courage, cunning, and endurance. Later, as Christianity took hold, children learned prayers in Latin, though most could neither read nor write. Memory was their library and storytelling their only textbook. Danger was always near. Sickness moved easily through the crowded turf houses. Winters were brutal, and famine at times took the youngest first. Graves of children, some only a few months old, have been found near the settlements, their brief lives a reminder of how fragile survival really was. Even so, families went on having children, not for love alone, but out of necessity. More hands meant more help, and more help meant a better chance the household would endure. In Greenland, a child's laughter could break the long monotony of hardship, but behind every smile lay a sobering fact: they were being made ready for a life of constant struggle. From birth they were heirs to the same resilience their parents had carried across the sea, the resilience that kept the settlement alive for generations. In Greenland's Viking settlements, survival was not won only by the men who hunted or ploughed. It was held together by the ceaseless labour of women. Within the dim turf houses, women's work was the unseen thread that kept families alive, and without it, the colony would have unravelled inside a single generation. Weaving stood at the centre of that labour. Wool from sheep and goats was carded, spun, and turned into cloth on the upright looms that rose in the smoky rooms of the farmhouses. That cloth was not merely for wearing, it was money. Woven wool, known as varvmal, was traded across the North Atlantic, and in Greenland it became one of the colony's most valuable exports. A woman's skill at the loom, then, was not only domestic but economic power. Her hours bent over the frame shaped the fortunes of her whole household. But weaving was only one thread of the load she carried. Women ran the dairy, milking cows and goats and making butter, cheese and skyr, a kind of sour milk curd. These were staples of the Greenland diet, stored with care to last the long winter. A spoiled batch could mean hunger months later. Women also kept the hearth, feeding the fire through endless nights and cooking with little more than fish, seal meat and dried grain. Their work called for constant watchfulness, since a single lapse could leave a family cold and starving. Childbearing piled on yet another hardship. With scant medical knowledge and unforgiving conditions, giving birth was perilous. Many women died young, leaving households broken. Those who lived carried infants strapped to their backs while they spun wool or tended the livestock. Children were often raised in common, with older daughters helping to mind their younger siblings, binding women's work still more tightly to the survival of the whole community. Women were keepers of memory as well. In the evenings, when the fires burned low, they recited sagas, prayers, and the tales of ancestors. As Christianity spread, they kept the devotional life going, teaching children their first prayers and arranging the family's rituals around the feast days. They became both spiritual anchors and guardians of culture, making sure that Norse identity survived even at the frozen margins of the known world. Their names hardly ever surface in the sagas, yet Greenland's Viking women were the colony's backbone. Their weaving clothed the settlers. Their dairy stocked the larders. Their labour raised the walls of every household. In silence and smoke, they wove the very fabric of life, proving that survival in Greenland was as much a woman's triumph as a man's. Even at the edge of the world, faith made the journey alongside the settlers. When Eric the Red's people first came to Greenland, most were still bound to the old Norse gods: Odin the all-seeing, Thor the thunderer, and Freya of fertility and love. Sacrifices, charms, and sagas had long bound them to a spiritual world, the same one that had steered their ancestors for many generations. But as the colony grew into its own, a change was already sweeping through Scandinavia. Christianity had taken hold there, and its reach eventually followed the sea lanes all the way to Greenland's fjords. The turn was a sharp one. Eric himself would have none of it, clinging stubbornly to the old gods of his fathers. His wife, Theodild, felt otherwise, and embraced the new faith wholeheartedly. Over Eric's objections, she was determined to raise a small church close to their farm at Bretalid. According to the sagas, Eric refused ever to set foot inside it, brushing the new religion off as something soft and unmanly. Even so, Theodild's church became a place where people gathered, the very first Christian church in Greenland. From that humble little building of turf-walled stone, the faith slowly spread its roots. By the opening years of the 12th century, the colony had bishops, priests and churches built of stone, the grandest being the great cathedral at Gardar, whose remains still linger today. Thick stone walls rise above the grass, a quiet witness to belief in a land where merely staying alive was a daily struggle. Religion offered more than ceremony. It stitched Greenland into the fabric of the wider world. Bishops in Norway dispatched priests, and in return the Greenlanders shipped back walrus ivory, furs and hides to settle their tithes and keep that spiritual thread from breaking. Faith worked its way into ordinary life as well. Old pagan feasts were swapped out or reworked into Christian holy days. Infants were baptized, weddings were blessed, and the dead were laid to rest in hallowed ground. Even on this brutal frontier, the settlers longed to belong to the universal Christian body, to feel that their souls were bound up with those in Norway, in Iceland, and far beyond. And yet the old ways never fully disappeared. Amulets carved in the shape of Thor's hammer have turned up beside crosses, a sign that many Greenlanders quietly hedged their bets, carrying both traditions with them into an unknown future. In so dangerous a place, it only made sense to appeal to every power within reach, the old alongside the new. Faith gave the settlers something beyond mere survival. It gave them meaning. To bow their heads in prayer inside a turf church while the wind screamed outside was to declare that life here was not only endurance, but part of some greater divine order. Their faith could not thaw the ice or gentle the frozen soil, yet it lent them the nerve to stand against both. Greenland may have seemed like the world's furthest edge, but the Norse who lived there were never truly cut adrift. Right from the start, staying alive meant keeping their ties to Iceland and Norway intact. The settlers could make wool, dairy and hides of their own, but a great deal lay beyond their reach: iron for tools, timber for building, and the fine goods that marked a person's standing. To close that gap, they leaned on trade, spinning lifelines across the storm-lashed North Atlantic. Walrus ivory was their most treasured export. Polished and carved, the tusks were carried off to Europe to be worked into chess pieces, sacred objects, and costly ornaments. Hunting the walrus was grueling work. It called for long journeys north into freezing waters, past polar bears, dangerous seas, and biting cold. But the ivory sold dearly, and for a while it kept the colony worth remembering in Europe's markets. Along with ivory went furs, sealskins, and even cordage twisted from walrus hide, goods that kept Greenland knotted into the broader medieval economy. Ships came back the other way, loaded with grain, iron and wood, all the things the land itself could not yield. Priests and bishops shuttled back and forth, holding the colony's link to the church intact. Letters and hearsay drifted in with word of kings, crusades and wars that felt unimaginably distant, and yet still tugged at Greenland's fate. Every ship that slid into the fjords was at once a comfort and a warning. They had not been forgotten, but they were very far away. Isolation, though, was always waiting. Whole years might slip by without a single sail from Europe. A bad storm, a shift in politics, or plain neglect could sever Greenland's tie to the outside world. In those long silences, the settlers had to make dwindling stores last, mend broken tools with bone or stone, and improvise where trade would once have rescued them. The mental strain of that uncertainty was crushing. Come every summer, families would search the horizon for sails, hoping and praying a ship would show itself. For all the hardship, the Greenlanders stayed proud members of the Norse world. They passed down tales of Leif Erikson sailing still further west, toward lands thick with forest and game. They sent gifts to kings and to churches, staking their claim within the Norse story. But beneath that pride lay a brittle truth. Their survival rested on ships that might never arrive. Greenland was connected, yes, but only ever by a thread, caught somewhere between trade and isolation, between belonging and abandonment. For centuries, the north of Greenland held on, wringing a fragile life out of the ice. Yet by the 14th and 15th centuries, the settlements began to falter. Archaeology and saga together point to a slow coming apart, not one sudden catastrophe, but a steady dimming, like a fire slowly running out of fuel. Climate was one enemy. The so-called Little Ice Age closed its grip on the North Atlantic, bringing harsher winters and briefer summers. Pastures thinned, hay crops failed, and livestock starved. Farming, always a gamble, grew nearly hopeless. Families butchered their animals too soon, shrank their herds, and struggled to keep anything in storage. The bones of children from later graves carry the marks of malnutrition, plain proof that hunger stalked the colony's final years. Trade withered too as walrus ivory lost its worth in Europe, elbowed aside by elephant ivory out of Africa. Greenland's main exports simply collapsed. Fewer and fewer ships appeared. Without imported iron, timber and grain, the settlers were forced to turn inward, patching tools with bone and roofs with whatever driftwood washed ashore. Isolation, once merely an inconvenience, had become a death sentence. Friction with the Inuit may have added to it. The Norse called them scralings, and though the evidence suggests contact, trade and stretches of coexistence, tensions surely flared. Inuit kayaks and hunting methods were far better suited to the Arctic, and where the Norse farmers stubbornly held to their European ways, the Inuit flourished as the settlers failed. Some scholars believe the contest over resources, over seals, walrus and fishing grounds only sharpened the Norse decline. Religion held firm to the very end. Churches were still raised and priests still said Mass even as the pews grew empty. A wedding feast in the early 15th century is the last written trace of Norse Greenland, one small flash of joy set against the fading. After that, only silence. By the mid-1400s, no ships came back, no messages arrived. The colony slipped out of European memory, its people swallowed into the very land they had fought so fiercely to hold. When later explorers stumbled on the ruins, the stone churches, the caved-in farmhouses, the deserted fields, they met with haunting reminders of endurance. Turf walls still leaned into the wind. Gravestones still marked names no one remembered. The Norse of Greenland had not fallen for want of courage, but because even courage has its limits. At the edge of the world, they lasted as long as any people could, until the ice, the hunger, and the silence finally took them. For the Illyrians, marriage was never simply two people deciding to share a life. It was the joining of bloodlines, the sealing of clan alliances, and at times the way rivals kept from coming to blows. In a world where kinship decided who protected you, who honored you, and who kept you alive, marriage stood first as a political and social contract, and only second as a private bond. Clans were the heart of Illyrian society. Every man and woman belonged not merely to a household, but to a sprawling web of kin that stretched across valleys and hilltop settlements. These clans held the land, the resources, and the warriors. So when two young people married, the moment reshaped far more than their own days. It reshaped the ties between whole groups. A single marriage could secure peace between enemies, tighten a trading bond, or firm up a military pact. In that sense, the personal was forever political. The bargaining over a match fell to the elders, men of standing who weighed each advantage with care. They considered the wealth of the bride's family, the good name of the groom's line, and the long gains such a union might bring. A marriage was rarely made on impulse. It was the fruit of careful reckoning, a strategy for surviving in a world of shifting loyalties. Even so, this focus on the clan did not drain marriage of its symbolic weight. Weddings were the moments when a clan put its shared identity on display. The joining of two families was hailed not only as a milestone for the couple, but as a victory for the wider community. Songs, rituals, and public ceremony all reminded everyone present that marriage reached well past the bride and groom. It was a fresh link in the chain of kinship that held the Illyrians together. For the two people at the centre of it, this clan-first view could be both a gift and a weight. A bride might be handed to a family she barely knew, her duty bound up in promises her father had made. A groom might find his marriage shaped more by alliances than by any affection. Still, within these unions bonds could deepen with time, forged by shared labour, by children, and by the constant knowledge that their marriage carried the weight of entire clans. To marry, in Illyrian society, was to step into a web of shared destiny. It was arranged, negotiated, and carefully steered by the elders of the clan. Fathers, uncles, and respected male leaders were the architects of these unions, sitting down together to weigh the benefits and the obligations of every possible match. To them, the happiness of the bride and groom mattered less than the prosperity, safety, and influence of their families. The process could be long and painstaking. Elders considered lineage, wealth, land rights, and even old grudges. If two clans shared a history of feuding, the marriage could close the wound and forge a bond stronger than any treaty. If a family needed to shore up its position, marrying into a richer or more respected clan was a way to climb. For warrior families, a union could guarantee military backing when conflict came. In every case, marriage was a calculated move in the chess game of survival. For the bride and groom, that usually meant little say in their own futures. Young women in particular were subject to their fathers' decisions, as those fathers hunted for the most advantageous match. A bride might be promised to a man she scarcely knew, her marriage settled while she was still a child. Grooms too were held to the choices of their elders. A young man might dream of a certain match, but duty nearly always outweighed desire. Yet arranged marriages carried real benefits of their own. In a world where clans faced steady threats from rival tribes, foreign invaders, and the harshness of nature itself, these unions offered stability. A young couple entered marriage with the full backing of two extended kin groups. Their farms were better supplied, their children more secure, and their quarrels smoothed over by a broad network of family alliances. The rituals around these marriages only underlined their collective nature. The negotiations were not hidden away but often carried out in public gatherings, where the agreement was witnessed and celebrated by the community. That openness made the marriage more than a private bond, it made it a communal contract. Everyone who watched was reminded that marriage was a tool for shaping the destiny of the whole clan. In this way, arranged marriages were less about smothering individual choice, and more about ensuring the survival of the group. They embodied the Illyrian conviction that the clan's strength came first, and that private lives existed inside that larger frame. No Illyrian marriage was truly finished without an exchange of wealth, most often in the form of a dowry. The dowry was more than a present from the bride's family. It was a declaration of honor, of stability, and of how seriously the alliance was meant. In a society where land, livestock, and weapons marked a person's standing, the dowry served as both a practical resource and a potent symbol. For the bride's family, providing one was a chance to show their strength and their generosity. A wealthy household might send her off with sheep, goats, or even a prized horse, along with woven cloth, tools, and goods for the home. The more impressive the dowry, the greater the respect the clan could command. A thin or grudging offering, by contrast, invited whispers of weakness that could stain a family's name. The groom's family, for their part, were not simply on the receiving end. To accept a dowry was to accept responsibility. It was a pledge to treat the bride well, to hold up the alliance, and to keep the trust that the exchange had sealed. In certain regions, there are also traces of bride price customs, where the gifts travelled the other way, from the groom's relatives toward the bride's family. Such an exchange underlined the notion that a marriage was no simple purchase, but a shared investment, tying two clans together through mutual obligation and expectation. What went into these dowries tells us a great deal about Aryan life as well. Livestock led the way, for animals were wealth that could walk. They yielded food, clothing, and goods to trade. Metal objects, when they could be had, were treasured, since iron weapons and tools offered both practical and military edge. A woman's dowry frequently held woven cloth, blankets, and jewelry, which were not merely ornaments but evidence of the bride's skill and diligence. These goods stocked the new home, so that the young pair started married life with a measure of security. Dowry ceremonies were public and celebratory. As the gifts changed hands, whole communities came together to watch the transfer, and feasting, music, and blessings often followed. That openness mattered, for it made certain the marriage contract was not merely a matter between two households, but was recognized and supported by the entire web of clans. Beyond its economics, the dowry carried spiritual meaning too. It marked the bride's passage from one family into another, easing her way into her husband's home. Seen like this, the dowry was more than wealth. It was a bridge, joining old bonds to new duties and helping the alliance last. For the Aryans, marriage was never only a social and economic arrangement. It was also a sacred moment that reached into the spiritual world. At the heart of the ceremony stood fertility rites, rituals meant to guarantee that the union would bear fruit, that children would come, and that land and herds would thrive under the favor of the gods. Strip away fertility, and marriage lost much of its point, for a clan's strength rested on the growth of its families. Before the wedding feast, offerings were commonly made to the deities of fertility and plenty. Archaeological finds and later Roman accounts hint that animals such as sheep, goats, or bulls were sacrificed to call down divine goodwill. The blood of the offering was sometimes scattered around the wedding site as a sign of life and continuity. In some areas, the couple themselves may have been marked with blood or oil showing that they took part in a rite far greater than themselves. Fire had its place as well. In many Indo-European traditions, flames stood for purification and fresh starts, and the Irians were no exception. A couple might circle a fire, spring over the flames, or share a meal cooked at the sacrificial hearth. Such acts were not mere symbols. They bound the couple to the endless round of birth, death, and renewal that shaped all life in Irian belief. The bride tended to be the focus of these fertility rites. Clothed in her finest and hung with jewelry, she was presented both as the future mother of children and as the living image of prosperity. Female kin sometimes attended her with chants, dances, or blessings, calling on the ancestors and the spirits of fertility. Herbs and flowers might be worked into her clothing, each chosen for its power to draw health, love, and fecundity. The groom, for his part, was expected to prove himself ready as protector and provider. In some customs, he took part in ritual hunts or trials of strength before the wedding, showing that he was fit to head a household. These feats linked manhood to fertility too, for a strong hunter promised a strong line of descendants. Taken together, these rites gave marriage a sacred dimension that ran deeper than contracts and dowries. To marry was not merely to bind families. It was to invite the gods to bless the union, to renew the clan's strength, and to make sure that life itself would carry on through children, herds, and fields. No Irian wedding was whole without music and dance. Once the dowries had changed hands and the rituals were done, the grave business of alliance gave way to a public outpouring of joy. For the clans, this was far more than amusement. It was a chance to celebrate survival, kinship, and the endurance of their people. Music set the pulse of the feast. Simple instruments such as flutes, horns, and stringed lyres carried the melody, while drums and rattles drove the beat. Songs often told of heroic deeds, storied ancestors, or the favor of the gods. At weddings, verses were made up on the spot to praise the bride's beauty, the groom's strength, and the joining of their families. These songs restated the whole purpose of the gathering, to knit the living community together while honoring the voices of the past. Dance mattered just as much. Men and women alike joined hands in circular dances, moving to the drums. The circle stood for unity, for endlessness, for the eternal cycles of life and death. Some dances were slow and solemn, matching the dignity of the day. Others turned wild and full of energy, standing for fertility, vitality, and the vigor of the new household. Young people sometimes performed competitive dances that showed off agility and stamina, while elders moved with measured grace, reminding everyone of the wisdom that steered the clan. The feasting that went with these performances was lavish, at least by Irian standards. Roasted meat from the sacrificed animals was passed among all, with the choicest cuts kept for the bride, the groom, and the leading elders. Wine, mead, or fermented drink flowed without stint, loosening tongues and feeding songs deep into the night. Food was not merely nourishment, but part of the ritual itself. To eat together was an act of solidarity, a sign that the whole community stood behind the new marriage. At times the festivities stretched on for days, drawing in not only close kin but neighbouring clans as well. These gatherings were more than private affairs. They were chances to firm up alliances, settle quarrels, and remind everyone of the ties that held them together. Laughter, dancing, and song helped ease old tensions, so that even rival families could share in the pleasure of the occasion. In this way, Irian wedding celebrations were no idle diversions. They were affirmations of life and continuity, where music, dance, and feasting turned the obligations of marriage into shared joy. Through rhythm, movement, and common food, the people of the Highlands declared that this union belonged not to two alone, but to all of them. For the Irians, marriage was not just a social and economic alliance. It was a sacred act that needed the blessing of the gods, and in their world, blessings rarely came for free. To win divine favor, animal sacrifice stood at the center of the wedding ritual, serving both as an offering and as a symbolic transfer of life. Which animal was chosen depended on the wealth and rank of the family. A prosperous clan might sacrifice a bull or a horse, beasts tied to strength, fertility, and prestige. Humbler households might offer sheep, goats, or pigs, creatures still bound up with plenty and reproduction. Whatever its size, each sacrifice carried the same meaning, a life surrendered to secure the couple's fertility, the health of children to come, and the prosperity of the joined clans. The act itself was usually public, carried out before the assembled community. Priests or clan elders holding ritual authority led the proceedings. The animal was decked with garlands or painted marks, then brought to an altar or sacred stone. With prayers and invocations to the Urian gods, its blood was let onto the ground, mingling with the soil as a sign of renewal and continuity. The earth drank the offering, and in exchange, it was believed, the gods would grant abundance. Portions of the animal were often burned in a fire, the smoke climbing skyward as a message to the divine. The rest was cooked and shared among the guests at the wedding feast. This communal eating gave the sacrifice a second meaning. It reminded all present that the marriage was not only blessed by the gods, but also upheld by the unity of the people. To eat the sacrificial meat was to enter the sacred contract, binding every participant to the marriage's success. Sacrifice held a protective side as well. Spilling blood was thought to drive off evil spirits and misfortune, guarding the couple from harm in their new life together. It was a form of cleansing, a way to make certain no ill omens trailed them into their home. Through such rituals, Urian weddings bridged the human and divine worlds. Sacrifices lent weight to promises, reminding everyone that marriage was more than a social bond. It was a sacred covenant kept by gods, ancestors, and the blood of offerings poured into the earth. In Urian society, the bride was more than a party to the marriage. She was the centerpiece of the ritual, the emblem of fertility, prosperity, and the clan's continuation. While the men bargained over the terms and performed the sacrifices, the women saw that the customs surrounding the bride were observed with care. These traditions raised the bride into a figure of both honor and responsibility, carrying the hopes of two families into her new home. Preparation began days ahead of the wedding. Female relatives bathed the bride, combed out her hair, and dressed her in jewelry. Necklaces of bronze, silver, or glass beads showed off her family's wealth, while belts and fibula brooches fastened garments that displayed her skill at weaving. Some pieces were heirlooms handed down through generations, tying her to the women who had come before. This dressing was not mere beautification. It was a rite of transformation, marking her passage from maiden to wife. Symbolic rituals framed her departure from the household she was born into. In some traditions, she may have been veiled, standing for both modesty and the mystery of her new role. Women sang laments, bittersweet songs that mourned the bride's parting from her family even as they blessed her future. These chants pressed home the truth that marriage meant leaving one world behind to enter another. The journey to the groom's house was a ritual in itself. Often escorted by relatives, the bride was led in procession, sometimes on horseback, sometimes on foot, through the community. Along the way, neighbors blessed her with gifts of food, drink, or tokens meant to turn aside misfortune. This public passage remade her from daughter into wife before everyone's eyes, so that her transition was witnessed and made legitimate. Once at the groom's home, further rituals sealed her new identity. She might circle the hearth, symbolizing her entry into the spiritual heart of the household. Bread, milk, or honey could be offered to her as omens of abundance. In some cases, she kindled a new fire in the home, carrying forward the theme of continuity and fertility. Despite her slight voice in how the marriage was arranged, the rites that centered on the bride affirmed how vital her role truly was. She was not merely moving between families. She embodied the promise of generations to come, bearing with her the blessings of her kin, the hopes of her ancestors, and the sacred trust of keeping the clan alive. Every Irian marriage was more than a personal union. It was a political and social contract woven into the very fabric of clan alliances. In a world where survival hung on networks of kinship, each marriage tightened the bonds between groups, created obligations, and at times healed old wounds. To the Irians, the wedding feast was as much about securing the clan's future as it was about celebrating the bride and groom. Alliances forged through marriage were practical instruments of diplomacy. Rival clans might use a marriage to end feuds, sealing peace with ties of blood rather than fragile treaties. A son marrying into a rival household meant both sides now shared grandchildren, and killing one's own kin was a line few were willing to cross. In other cases, clans sought partners not for peace, but for power, binding themselves to wealthy neighbors, able warriors, or families with wide trade connections. The obligations of these alliances ran deep. Families were expected to stand by one another in times of famine, conflict, or raiding. A man might call on his wife's clan for reinforcements in war, or for food when the crops failed. Likewise, a woman could appeal to the family she was born into for protection if she was mistreated, creating a system of checks that kept some balance of power. This web of obligations meant that marriage ties could ripple across whole regions, shaping Irian politics in quiet but lasting ways. Marriage also reinforced the social hierarchy. The most prestigious unions joined powerful clans and were often marked by lavish dowries and grand feasts. Smaller families gained from all of this in a roundabout way, since alliances filtered downward, shaping trade quarrels and deciding who led at the local level. Marriage, then, worked like a map of the social order, marking out who already held power and who was still climbing toward it. What made these alliances feel real was the way the whole community took part. When a wedding was held, everyone present became a witness to the new bond. The songs that were sung praised more than the bride and groom, they praised the joining of the clans themselves. Guests who shared the feast were folded into the agreement, reminded that their fortunes had now been tied together. Marriage, in short, was the glue that held Illyrian society in place. It smoothed over old rivalries, strengthened defences, and kept the fragile balance of power steady among clans that prized their independence fiercely. Two young people might stand at the centre of the ceremony, but the true union was between whole bloodlines, and their shared future bound them more firmly than any written document ever could. The Illyrians eventually slipped out of history, drawn into the Roman world and later overtaken by newer peoples, yet the echoes of their marriage customs outlasted the tribal societies that produced them. Grounded in loyalty to the clan, in fertility rites, and in shared celebration, these traditions left their mark on the social fabric of the Balkans, where kinship and marriage went on being seen as something larger than a private arrangement. One lasting inheritance was the importance placed on the clan. The Illyrians held that marriage joined not just two people but two lineages, an idea that survived in Balkan villages for centuries. Even into medieval and early modern times, marriages were still arranged with alliances and protection in mind, much as the Illyrians had once done. The belief that one family's honour rested on the alliances of another kept shaping the expectations and the bargaining that surrounded a marriage. Their fertility rituals carried across the generations as well. The blood sacrifices of bulls and goats eventually yielded to Christian blessings, but the symbolism of fire, food, and plenty stayed behind. Lighting the hearth in a new household, blessing bread and wine for a newlywed couple, or circling a fire during a festival can all be read as faint reflections of Illyrian practices that once tied people to the gods of nature and fertility. The communal side of the weddings, the music and the dancing and the feasting, proved just as durable. The traditional circle dances still performed at Balkan weddings today carry the old symbolism of unity and continuity. The custom of song, of improvising verses to honour the couple, endured too, bending to new languages and new faiths while keeping the same purpose, to declare in front of everyone that a marriage was a celebration for the whole community and not for two people alone. Perhaps the clearest inheritance lies in the tension between duty and personal choice. For the Illyrians, arranged marriages were a matter of stability. Modern life has moved toward individual preference, yet traces of that older, collective way of thinking remain. Even now, in certain rural customs, elders take a firm hand in approving or guiding a union, echoing the ancient conviction that marriage matters far too much to be surrendered entirely to youthful longing. In the end, Illyrian marriage traditions show a people who grasped that survival depended on bonds, between men and women, between families, between clans, and between mortals and the divine. The Illyrians themselves disappeared from the historical stage, but the patterns they wove through marriage lived on, carried forward in rituals, in symbols, and in the enduring human wish to find unity in the face of life's uncertainties. Harald Sigurdsson, the man later remembered as Hardrada, the hard ruler, came into the world in 1015, when Norway hung somewhere between chaos and kingship. He was born into the powerful household of Sigurd Syr, a minor king in the fertile district of Ringerike. His mother, Asta Gudbrandsdatter, was already a familiar name in Norway's political circles, for she was the mother of Olaf Haraldsson, the future Saint Olaf and King of Norway. That link placed the young Harald at the very heart of dynastic ambition from the beginning. Norway in those years was no peaceful realm. It was a patchwork of chieftains, competing kings, and outside interests, with both Denmark and England casting long shadows across the North Sea. The Viking Age was still breathing, still animated by the old appetite for raiding and conquest, but Christianity was starting to reshape the society around it. Harald grew up where these worlds met, listening to tales of gods and sagas, while watching priests and bishops plant the new faith in his homeland. It was a boyhood steeped in both sword and sermon. What set Harald apart, even as a child, was his sheer size and his fierce resolve. Later sagas describe him as unusually tall, perhaps over 6 feet, looming above most men of his day, with piercing eyes and a commanding air. By his teens he was said to be restless, daring, and already handy with weapons. His half-brother Olaf, determined to bring Norway under a single crown, became both an example to follow and a protector. Yet Harald's childhood was anything but safe. To be raised in a royal household in 11th century Norway was to live under constant threat. Alliances shifted like the tides, and enemies were never far off. For Harald, that world bred toughness and ambition. He was never meant to live quietly on his father's estates. He was shaped to fight, to lead, and to seize a place for himself in a violent age. In his very birth we can see the arrival of a figure who would embody the last great surge of Viking ambition. He was a youngest son, not expected to inherit much, yet fate had grander designs. From the day he was born, his life was set on a road of blood, exile and conquest, a saga that would reach across continents and close with one of the defining battles of the Viking Age. By the summer of 1030, Harold was only 15, and yet he was already marching toward one of the most decisive battles in Norway's history. His half-brother Olaf Haraldsson, later canonized as Sainter, Olaf had been driven from the throne by a coalition of Norwegian chieftains allied with the mighty Danish king Cnut the Great. Determined to win back his crown, Olaf gathered his loyalists for a desperate bid to retake Norway, and among them was young Harold, hungry to prove himself. The armies met at Stiklestad, a country valley that would be carved forever into legend. On one side stood Olaf with his faithful warriors, many of them drawn from the smaller clans still true to him. On the other stood an overwhelming host of rebels backed by Denmark, eager to see Olaf fall for good. The odds were bleak, but Harold refused to stay behind. Sword and shield in hand, he took his place in the shield wall beside hardened veterans, his brother's fate and perhaps his own hanging in the balance. The fighting was brutal and confused. Spears rang against shields, arrows darkened the sky, and war cries rolled through the valley. Olaf fought bravely but was cut down in the melee, his death later remembered as a martyrdom for Christianity in Norway. Harold, barely more than a boy, battled fiercely at his brother's side until he too took grievous wounds. Bleeding and slashed, he fell amid the slaughter, but unlike Olaf he lived. His survival, though, meant exile. With Olaf dead and the rebellion triumphant, Harold could not stay in Norway. So he fled eastward with a handful of loyal companions, leaving his homeland and family behind. Stiklestad was both a crushing defeat and a strange beginning for him. It stripped away his brother, his home, and his immediate future in Norway, yet it also pushed him onto the wider world stage. Driven into exile, he would wander farther than nearly any Viking before him, to Kiev, Constantinople, Sicily and beyond, carrying the scars of Stiklestad and the burning wish to return one day as something more than a survivor. After the blood-soaked fields of Stiklestad, Harold was a fugitive. Norway was closed to him, and Knut's dominion stretched wide across Scandinavia. For a young warrior whose ambition ran as deep as Harold's, exile was not an ending, but an opening. With his band of loyal men he pressed east, across the forests and rivers of Sweden, until he reached the glittering court of Prince Yaroslav the Wise in Kiev. Yaroslav's court was a meeting place of cultures, where Slavs, Norsemen, Greeks and steppe nomads mingled in the busy capital. To Harold, it was a land of opportunity. He offered his sword to Yaroslav and soon earned a place among the prince's elite warriors. The sagas paint him as bold and commanding. Even in his youth, his charisma drew men to his side. Yet Kiev was only a stepping stone. Harold wanted adventure, riches, and a fame beyond anything Scandinavia could give. From Kiev he travelled south to the great empire of Byzantium. Arriving at Constantinople, Miklagard, the great city as the Norse called it, Harold joined the Varangian Guard, the emperor's elite corps of foreign fighters. These men, renowned for their loyalty and their ferocity, were often drawn from the Norse world, and Harold rose quickly among them. His height, his presence, and his battle-tested courage made him stand out even in a brotherhood of hardened killers. For close to a decade he fought under the banners of Byzantium. He sailed to Sicily to battle Arab forces. He marched through Asia Minor, clashing with the empire's enemies. He even fought in the Holy Land, guarding pilgrims and securing routes for the emperor. The sagas, never shy with their praise, claim he fought 80 battles in these years, earning both wealth and scars. The Varangian Guard was more than a military unit. It was a brotherhood bound by oath and shared fortune. Harold's service brought him enormous riches, gold and jewels and silks out of the empire's treasuries. Wealth he carefully set aside with Yaroslav in Kiev for his eventual return to Norway. Just as valuable as the treasure was the reputation. His name grew known far past Scandinavia. He was no longer the boy who had fled Stiklestad. He was a commander of the Emperor's Guard, a man who had built his legend across the Mediterranean. Exile had turned into opportunity. In Constantinople, Harold became far more than a dispossessed prince. He became a warrior of renown, his saga swelling with every campaign, his ambition burning hotter than ever. Those years in Constantinople remade Harold from a wounded exile into a seasoned commander. To the Byzantines he was known not as Harold but as Araltes, and within the Varangian Guard he soon marked himself out for cunning and ferocity. These warriors were the emperor's personal bodyguards, feared across the empire as much for their towering size as for their loyalty, and Harold quickly climbed to a place of leadership among them. The sagas portray him as restless, never willing to sit in garrison when there was fighting to be had. He campaigned along the empire's far-flung frontiers. In Sicily he took part in the Byzantine struggle against Arab forces, storming fortresses and raiding coastal towns. In the east he fought the Bulgars and other foes pressing on imperial borders. Some tales even set him in Jerusalem, where he supposedly helped guard the Holy City during an expedition into the Levant. Whether every story is true or embellished, the picture is plain. Harold sought out war the way other men sought out food, and he found it in abundance. His service left him immensely wealthy. The Varangians were famously rewarded with gold and plunder, and Harold proved shrewd in hoarding his share. Rather than spending it all in the taverns and markets of Constantinople, he sent his treasures back to Kiev, entrusting them to Prince Yaroslav for safekeeping. That caution showed where his ambitions truly lay, always on the future, on returning to Norway not as an exile, but as a man rich enough to buy loyalty. Still, his rise was not without friction. The sagas hint at quarrels with Byzantine officials and even suggest he may have fallen out of favour with the emperor. One story accuses him of imprisoning a noblewoman or overreaching his authority, forcing him to flee the empire under difficult circumstances. Exaggerated or not, such tales capture his character, bold, willful, and unwilling to bend, even before emperors. By the time he left Constantinople around 1042, Harold was no longer the boy who had limped away from Stiklestad. He had grown into a seasoned commander, a man who had glimpsed the riches of empires and measured himself against the fiercest opponents of his day. His treasuries were heavy with gold, his body marked with scars, and his heart still ruled by ambition. Years of exile had hardened him like metal in a forge, and now Harold Hardrada was prepared to claim the future he believed was owed to him. By the early N40s, he possessed nearly everything a Viking prince could hope for: wealth, fame, and an authority won on the battlefield. The single thing still missing was the prize he had pursued since boyhood, a throne. Backed by the fortune he had prudently stored away in Kiev and the reputation earned in his Byzantine campaigns, Harold turned north again, resolved to seize the standing he felt was his by right in Scandinavia. He went first to Kiev, where he collected the treasures he had left in the keeping of Prince Yaroslav the Wise. His bond with Yaroslav, though, ran deeper than any hoard of coin. During his years away, Harold had married Yaroslav's daughter, Elisiv, sealing a strong alliance with the Kievan court. With his wife and his riches beside him, he sailed toward Norway, prepared to overturn a political order that had shut him out for more than 10 years. Norway at that moment was ruled by King Magnus the Good, the illegitimate son of Harold's half-brother, Saint Olaf. Magnus was capable and well regarded, yet Harold spotted an opening. As Olaf's surviving brother, he demanded his portion of the kingdom, pressing both his bloodline and the vast wealth he had carried home. Magnus could not simply brush the challenge aside, particularly since Harold had also drummed up backing in Denmark and Sweden. Even so, the standoff did not descend into slaughter. The two men chose instead to divide the crown, ruling Norway together as co-kings. It was a tense and grudging bargain, thick with rivalry and mutual suspicion. Harold, older and far more battle-worn, chafed against sharing power with Magnus, while Magnus, uneasy about his uncle's hunger for more, kept a close eye on him. Still, the compromise let Harold plant himself in Norway again without dragging the kingdom into open civil war. When Magnus died without warning in 1047, Harold became Norway's sole ruler. After all the years of exile, mercenary service and gnawing ambition, the throne he had chased since Stiklestad was finally his. But Norway alone did not satisfy him. Almost at once he looked beyond its borders, toward Denmark, toward England, toward anywhere his blade and his cleverness might extend his reach. Harald Hardrada had come home, not as a hunted man, but as a king. And true to himself, he had no intention of stopping at merely holding Norway. For him, kingship was only the opening of a story that would soon spread across northern Europe and, in the end, deliver him to his fate on an English field. From the very moment he secured the crown in 1047, Harold fixed his sights on Denmark, a realm Norway had long quarrelled with. Ruling Norway was, in his mind, not enough. He wanted the whole inheritance of his Viking ancestors, the North Sea Empire that had once bound Denmark, Norway, and even England under a single crown. His opponent was King Sweyn Estridsson, a shrewd and durable ruler who had already survived Magnus the Good. With Magnus gone, Harold threw campaign after campaign against him. For close to 20 years the two kings ground each other down, raiding, retaliating, and clashing across the seas for mastery. Harold's fleet battered the Danish coasts without pause, torching villages, carrying off livestock, and terrorizing Sweyn's people in an effort to erode his support. The sagas paint Harold as merciless in these wars, and it was here he earned his name, Hardrada, the hard ruler, a man who governed by sheer will and a sharp sword, punishing betrayal and driving his followers with unforgiving discipline. Yet for all his ferocity, Denmark would not break. Sweyn always seemed to find his feet again, gathering his forces and hitting back once Harold's ships pulled away. The war became less a matter of decisive triumphs than a slow contest to exhaust the other side. Sea battles stood at its heart. Sleek and lethal, Viking longships crowded the waters as Harold tried to blockade Denmark and choke it into surrender. He fought hard at engagements such as the one near Nisa in 1062, where his fleet dealt Sweyn heavy losses but could not finish him. It was a maddening rhythm. Harold kept winning on the water, yet he could never convert those wins into lasting political control. By the mid-1060s, both kings were worn thin. Harold had bled Norway dry, levying steep taxes to feed his ceaseless wars, while Sweyn clung stubbornly to his throne. In 1064 the two at last struck a truce, each acknowledging the other's rule and putting an end to the ruinous deadlock. For Harold it was a bitter settlement. He had dreamed of joining Norway and Denmark under one crown, and instead had to accept peace without a single conquest to show for it. But his ambition did not cool. If Denmark could not be his, then perhaps England could. Whispers of opportunity across the sea soon reached him, and Harold Hardrada, restless as ever, made ready to stake everything on one last audacious invasion. By the early 1060s he had fought in the east, reigned in the north, and battered Denmark in endless war, yet the fire in him still would not go out. When rumour arrived that the English throne might be within reach, he grasped at it as the ultimate prize, a chance to revive the old Viking legacy of England as a piece of a northern empire. His pretext came through a tangle of family ties and politics. The Danish king Canute the Great had once ruled England along with Denmark and Norway, forging a sprawling North Sea domain. That empire had splintered after his death, but Harold insisted he still held a rightful claim, inherited by way of treaty struck between Magnus the Good and Harthacnut of Denmark. When Harthacnut died in 1042, Magnus had briefly called himself King of England, and after Magnus was gone, Harold declared that this right had passed to him. The claim hung on thin legal threads, but Harold was not a man to be stopped by paperwork. His moment came in 1066. King Edward the Confessor of England died with no clear heir, throwing the succession into crisis. Harold Godwinson, the mighty Earl of Wessex, took the crown at once, but rivals challenged him just as quickly. William, Duke of Normandy, insisted Edward had promised him the throne, and Harold Hardrada saw his own chance to press his inherited claim by force. He did not act entirely alone. Tostig Godwinson, Harold Godwinson's own estranged brother, had been driven out of England and thirsted for revenge. Tostig threw in with Harold, pledging support and pushing him to invade. For Harold this was exactly the spark he needed, a chance to rally his warriors, rekindle Viking glory, and perhaps end his days as the last great conqueror of the age. In the summer of 1066 he assembled a huge fleet, some sources claim close to 300 ships, and set sail for England. His men were battle-hardened, many of them veterans of the Danish wars, hungry for plunder and renown. As the sails filled and the prows sliced through the swells, Harold must have felt destiny finally settling into his grasp. England, rich and fertile, lay waiting. In September of 1066, his long ambition became action. With hundreds of ships and thousands of men, he crossed the North Sea to press his claim to the English crown. Beside him rode Tostig Godwinson, the embittered exiled brother of Harold Godwinson, the newly crowned English king. Together, they meant to bring down Harold's rule and shape a new North Sea empire. The invasion opened in the north of England, where Harold struck with the speed and savagery that had marked his whole career. He landed his forces near the rivers and pressed swiftly toward York, the great northern stronghold. At Fulford, on the 20th of September in 1060s, he met the armies of the northern earls, Edwin of Mercia and Morcar of Northumbria. The fighting was brutal, but Harold's seasoned warriors proved unstoppable, driving the English back and crushing their resistance. The win was total. York yielded, and the gates of northern England seemed to swing open before him. After decades of war, exile, and hunger for power, Harold stood on the very edge of triumph. Buoyed by victory, he set about tightening his grip on the north. Oaths of loyalty were demanded, hostages taken, supplies collected. Harold felt secure enough to send part of his fleet back toward Norway, convinced the campaign was all but won. With York in hand, he expected the English crown to follow soon after. But fate moved quicker than he reckoned. King Harold Godwinson, who had been bracing to meet William of Normandy in the south, marched his army north at a furious pace, covering nearly 200 miles in under a week. He caught Harold Hardrada entirely off guard. The English king's sudden appearance would force a confrontation neither side could sidestep. Harold, encamped near Stamford Bridge with only part of his host, had not even put on full armour when word arrived that Harold Godwinson was almost upon him. The stage was set for one of the most dramatic clashes in English history. For Harold Hardrada, it would be the final trial of a lifetime's ambition, a battle that would decide not only his own fate, but the very close of the Viking Age. On the 25th of September, 1066, the saga of Harold Hardrada reached its last act at Stamford Bridge. Fresh from his win at Fulford and confident in his hold on the north, Harold was caught unready. His men were scattered, many without armour, some even lounging in the sun. They were expecting talks with York, not the abrupt arrival of Harold Godwinson's army, which had raced north at astonishing speed. The battle began with a desperate stand. Legend tells of a single towering Norse warrior who held the bridge alone against wave after wave of English soldiers, cutting them down until at last he was killed from below, a spear driven up through the planks beneath his feet. That act of defiance bought Harold's army precious minutes, but the odds were heavily against them. Harold Godwinson's troops were fresh, well-armed, and eager to destroy the invaders. Harold, faithful to his name, the hard ruler, would not retreat. Tall, fierce, and impossible to mistake on the field, he threw himself and his warriors into the fray with the same relentless nerve that had carried him from Norway to Byzantium and back. But fate showed no mercy. In the thick of the fighting, an arrow found his throat. The great Viking king fell, his voice lost amid the ring of steel and the shouting of men. His death broke the Norse spirit. His followers fought on in desperation, but leaderless they could not hold, and the tide turned fast. Vikings were cut down by the thousand, and of the great fleet that had crossed the North Sea, only a sliver made it home. The sagas say that although Harold had come to England with more than 300 ships, barely 24 were needed to carry the survivors back to Norway. His fall at Stamford Bridge was more than the death of a king. It was the symbolic end of an era. For nearly 3 centuries the Vikings had raided, traded, and ruled across Europe, dreaded as the terror of kingdoms and empires. With Harold's defeat, the age of the great Viking adventurers effectively drew to a close. Only weeks afterward, William of Normandy would triumph at Hastings and remake England forever, but the Viking threat itself was finished. So ended the saga of Harold Hardrada, warrior, exile, mercenary, king, and would-be conqueror of England. His life captured the restless spirit of the Viking Age, and his death marked its final chapter. After Stamford Bridge, the world of Europe moved on. Yet Harold's legend, fierce, ambitious, and unbending, lived on in the sagas that still name him the last great Viking.